On the night between March 31st and April 1st, 1922, on a farm near a small hamlet in southern Germany, something terrible happened. An unknown killer lures the people of that farm outside, one by one, and carries out a brutal slaughter. And then he walks into his victim's house and lives there for several more days. Their neighbors in the hamlet nearby are gripped by panic. Parents are afraid to let their children out of the house, and people who days before had been neighbors and friends now point fingers at one another, trying to work out who did it. The police cannot find the culprit, and the story keeps gathering more horrifying facts, uncovered as the investigation goes on. Months pass, then years. The number of clues and of suspects grows, but the police still have nowhere near enough for a serious charge. The last suspects were interrogated more than 60 years after the murders. And yet, despite all of it, nobody knows who held the weapon, why the killer, instead of running, appears to have stayed, and how a person walks into a snowbound farm, ends 6 lives in a single night, and walks back out of history without leaving a name. Today we are going to go through it all properly. The signs in the week before, the night of the murders itself, the evidence the investigation managed to save before it was trampled, each of the 5 main suspects, and try to answer the one question that matters. Who killed the people of Hinterkaifeck? Some places feel wrong before anything has happened in them. Hinterkaifeck was one of them. It was a single farmstead sunk into the low hills of Bavaria, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. Not a village, not even a hamlet. Just one cluster of buildings, a house joined to a barn, joined to a stable, standing alone where the fields give way to forest, more than a kilometer from the nearest neighbor. The name tells you how forgotten it was. Hinter. Hinter means behind. Kaifeck was the little settlement down the road. Hinterkaifeck was simply the place behind it, the house at the end of the track where the trees begin. This was Germany in 1922, 3 years out of a war it had lost, the money already rotting in people's hands. Out in the farmland, life ran older and slower than that. No electric light, no telephone. After dark, the fields went black, the forest came right up to the walls, and there was nothing between the family and the night but a few doors and a few locks. The farm had stood since the 1860s. By the spring of 1922, it belonged to the Gruber family, and the Grubers were not liked. They kept to themselves, paid their way, invited no one in, the kind of family whose curtains stayed shut. And in the last week of March, every living soul inside that house would be dead, killed one after another in a single night with a single tool by someone who has never, in more than 100 years, been named. 6 people lived at Hinterkaifeck. At the head of the household was Andreas Gruber, 63, a hard man, tight with money, harder still with his family, and disliked across the district for both. His wife, Cecilia, was 72. It had come to her decades earlier in a divorce settlement from her first husband, and she had brought it into the marriage back in 1886. Living with them was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, and Victoria's 2 children, a bright 7-year-old girl also called Cecilia, named for her grandmother, and a baby boy, Joseph, just 2 years old. And then there was the 6th, the newcomer, a maid named Maria Baumgartner, 44, hired to help on the farm, who arrived to begin her very first day of work on the afternoon of the 31st of March. She would be dead before sunrise. Maria had worked at Hinterkaifeck for less than 12 hours. She never properly unpacked. Remember her. Because of everyone in this story, she is the one who simply walked into it. A stranger with no idea what was already waiting inside that house. To understand why so many would later be suspected of wanting this family dead, you have to understand what lay beneath the Gruber household like rot under a floorboard. This is the first hard fact of the case. Not rumor, not legend, but a matter of court record. In 1915, Andreas Gruber and his own daughter Victoria were convicted of incest. The court found he had been abusing her for years. He was sentenced to a year in prison. Victoria, treated by the law of the time as a participant rather than a victim, served a month. He went to prison, he came back, and the abuse, by everything that surfaced later, did not stop. And the village knew. This was not a secret kept behind one closed door. It had been spoken aloud in the one place a Catholic farming community trusted above all others. Victoria had confessed it to a priest in the confessional that her own father had never let her go. Victoria's little boy, 2-year-old Joseph, asleep in his bassinet on the night of the murders, there were serious documented claims about who his father really was. In 1919, Victoria told the man she was seeing, a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, that the child had been fathered by Andreas, by her own father. Schlittenbauer reported it, then withdrew the complaint for reasons we will come back to, and then, under oath, swore to it again. The court ruled it wasn't enough, and Andreas walked free a second time. Hold on to that name. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor, Victoria's lover, a man who claimed to be the father of little Joseph, who had agreed to adopt the boy, and who lived only a few hundred meters away. He comes back into this story at the worst possible moment. So this was Hinterkaifeck, an isolated house, a disliked family, a father convicted of abusing his daughter, a child who may have been born of that abuse, and a household with every reason to keep the world at arm's length. And in the final weeks of March 1922, something began to come out of the trees toward it. For months before the killings, Hinterkaifeck had not been quiet. It began, as far as anyone could reconstruct, about half a year earlier, with the maid. Her name was Crescens Rieger, and she quit. The reason she gave, the one that spread through the district afterwards, was that she had been hearing noises in the attic. Footsteps, movement overhead where no one should have been. She decided the farm was haunted, and she left. Nobody took it seriously. A nervous servant, an old house settling. Bavaria in 1922 was full of both. But that is how these things begin, not with a scream, but with something small enough to explain away. In March, Andreas found a newspaper on the property, a Munich paper that no one in the house had bought, that no one nearby subscribed to. It had simply appeared, carried onto the farm by someone who had sat close enough to read it and left it behind. The way you leave a paper in a room you think of as your own. Then keys went missing and were never found, which meant someone had been inside, close enough to take them, and could now come and go through doors the family believed were locked against the night. A few days before the end of March, fresh snow fell, and in it, Andreas found footprints, a single line of tracks out of the forest, straight toward the house, toward a door in the machine room whose lock he found broken. He followed them back to the tree line. There were no tracks leading away. Someone had walked out of the woods toward the house, and as far as the snow was concerned, had never left. There is a rational version: snow shifts, fresh fall covers, an old trail. But strip the explanation away, and the bare shape does not soften. Tracks came in, none went out. That same night the family heard the footsteps again, overhead in the attic. Andreas took a lamp and climbed up to look. He found no one, or the house was playing tricks, or someone up there knew how to be still and waited a few feet away while the lamplight passed and went back down the stairs. Because afterwards, it became clear the killer had been living in that house, and the coldest theory is the simplest, that he never broke in at all. He was already inside, in the attic, for days, listening through the boards, learning their voices, learning which room held which sleeper, waiting for the night the new maid arrived and the household was whole. Andreas told people about all of it, the footprints, the noises, the missing keys, the broken lock. Neighbors offered to stay and watch the house with him. He refused every time, and he never went to the police. Maybe he was too proud, or maybe, given everything that family was hiding, the last thing he wanted was police walking through his house. There is one more sign. According to a school friend of little Cecilia, on the very night before the murders, the child's mother, Victoria, fled the house after a violent quarrel with Andreas and was found hours later, alone, out in the forest, in the dark. Friday, the 31st of March, 1922. In the afternoon, Maria Baumgartner came to the farm to begin her work. Her sister walked her there, stayed a short while, and left, almost certainly the last outsider to see the family alive. What happened after dark, the investigators could only reconstruct from the bodies and the scene. Late that evening, something drew the adults out of the warm house, through the stable, toward the barn, at the dark heart of the farmstead. One theory recorded at the time was that the animals were restless, and the family went to check on them. But there is a problem with it. Investigators later found that noise from the barn could not actually be heard inside the house. So, if it was not the animals that called them out into the cold, what did? We will never know. A sound, a knock, a face at a frosted window. Whatever it was, it worked, and it was deliberate. They were not attacked together. They were separated, drawn out one at a time into the dark by someone who had already decided exactly how the night would go. One by one they crossed the yard, and one by one they were killed. Andreas, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and the 7-year-old child. 4 of them struck down with the same weapon, a mattock, a heavy farm tool with a blade for breaking ground, taken from the family's own equipment. 4 bodies left in the barn. The next part of the story was no less horrifying. The youngest in the barn was the little girl, and the evidence from her body showed she did not die at once. The post-mortem indicated she survived for hours after she was struck, alone, in the dark, beside her family. It is the single detail that every investigator who ever worked this case carried with them for the rest of their lives. The killer was not finished. He walked back into the house and killed the last 2, the baby, Joseph, asleep in his bassinet, and Maria, the new maid, in her bed. The woman who had arrived that afternoon, who had worked a single day, who had no part in any of this family's secrets, and who died in a stranger's house on her first night under its roof. 6 people, 1 weapon, 1 night. And then, instead of running, the killer stayed. This is the detail that sets Hinterkaifeck apart from almost any murder in history. For 3 to 4 days after the household was wiped out, someone went on living in that house, with the dead still where they had fallen. The cattle were fed. When the farm was finally entered, the animals were healthy and cared for. The fire had been kept burning, the bread eaten, meat freshly cut from the pantry. Someone slept under that roof, ate at that table, and walked past the dead again and again, calm enough to cook a meal and warm their hands at the fire. And the world outside saw the signs, without understanding them. On the night of the murders, around 3 in the morning, a farmer passing near the forest saw two figures standing at the tree line. When they noticed him, they turned their faces away and did not move. We say the killer, singular, because it is easier. But the snow, the labor of moving 4 bodies, the upkeep of a working farm, a sighting like this, all of it has always left open a darker possibility, that it was more than one. The next night, a craftsman passed the farm and saw smoke rising. The oven was lit. As he came near, a man stepped out of the house and raised a lantern straight into his eyes so he could not make out a face, and then let him walk on. That is not the behavior of someone cornered and afraid. That is someone in command, deciding exactly how much a stranger would be allowed to see. And the man never forgot one more thing. The smoke had a foul, sickening smell. No one ever examined that oven. Whatever was burned in it went unrecorded and went with the killer. For 3 or 4 days, from a distance, the farm looked alive. Smoke from the chimney, animals fed, a figure moving in the yard. But everyone in it was dead. In the end, it was the small absences that raised the alarm. Little Cecilia did not come to school. For days her seat sat empty. The family missed Sunday Mass. Tradesmen who came to the farm could not raise anyone. On the 1st of April, 2 coffee sellers came to take an order, knocked, got no answer, and walked the yard. They noticed the gate to the machine room standing open, the same machine room with the broken lock, the one the footprints had led to. Thought nothing of it, and left. Days later, a mechanic arrived to repair an engine, waited about an hour, and when no one came, simply did the work alone. He labored for hours on a farm where 6 people lay dead a few meters away, packed up his tools, and went home. For most of a week, the world kept arriving at Hinterkaifeck and quietly leaving again. A child's empty desk, an empty pew, a knock with no answer. And no one realized the household had been dead for days, with the one who killed them perhaps still inside, watching through a gap in the curtain. It was only that afternoon that the neighbors finally acted. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Victoria's former lover, the man who had claimed baby Josef as his son, first sent 2 boys to look. When they came back saying they had seen no one, he went himself, with 2 other neighbors. They found the doors locked, they forced their way into the barn, and there, covered over with hay and an old door, were 4 bodies. What Schlittenbauer did in the next few minutes is the reason a shadow would hang over him for the rest of his life. We will come to it. For now, the alarm was raised, word reached the authorities, and a quiet farm at the edge of the woods became the scene of one of the most notorious crimes in German history. From the first hours, this investigation was doomed, and not only by the killer. A team came from Munich, but by the time they arrived, the crime scene had already been destroyed, not by the murderer, but by the public. Curious neighbors had walked through the house and barn, moved the bodies, handled whatever they liked. Some, almost beyond belief, cooked meals in the family's kitchen while the dead lay nearby. Whatever the killer had left behind, prints, fibers, anything, was trampled into nothing before a single trained investigator looked at it. The court physician carried out the autopsies in the barn itself and confirmed the obvious. A mattock had almost certainly done it. The victims' skulls were removed and sent to Munich, and later, in the chaos of another war, lost altogether. The first theory was robbery. It collapsed almost at once. A large sum in gold and silver was found untouched in the house. Whoever did this had fed the animals, eaten the bread, kept the fire burning, and left the cash. This was not a robbery. It was something else, and no one could say what. The weapon, when it finally surfaced, only deepened the dread. Less than a year later, the farm was deliberately torn down so the district need no longer look at it. And during the demolition, hidden in the loft, they found it, the mattock, still dark with dried blood. The killer had hidden it up in the attic, the same attic where the previous maid had heard footsteps and quit, the same attic the family had searched and found empty. It had been waiting up there the whole time. The demolition gave up one more thing, a small penknife lost in the hay that could never be tied to anyone for certain. And the leads never stopped coming. Local burglars, farm hands who knew where the money was kept, even seances with mediums claiming to name the killer from beyond. When evidence has been destroyed, people reach for any answer at all. The case dragged on for decades. More than 100 people were questioned. It was officially closed in 1955, and even then it would not die. The last interrogations were carried out in 1986 by a detective who chased it to the day he retired and never got his answer. 6 victims. No convictions, a crime scene ruined before it could be read. But the police did have suspects. Over the next few minutes you will hear the 5 names that have followed this case for a century, and the case for and against each one. And at the end, I want you to decide. Start with the man almost everyone in the region believed did it. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He lived only a few hundred meters away, the Gruber's closest neighbor. He had been Victoria's lover, had claimed to be the father of her son, had agreed to adopt the boy. He had wanted to marry Victoria, and Andreas had stood in the way. There were furious disputes over money and over the child, and he had even been the one to report Andreas for the continuing abuse. By any measure, there was bad blood between these two men, so he had motive. But what made the village whisper his name was his behavior at the scene. He was the first to step into that barn. The others froze in the doorway. Schlittenbauer did not. He moved through the horror with an unsettling calm, and he handled the bodies, disturbing them at the very moment the scene should have been left untouched. Then there was the door. The men had found everything locked, but the moment the bodies were found, Schlittenbauer walked to the house and unlocked the front door without any difficulty and went inside, alone, into a house where, for all anyone knew, the killer might still be waiting. How did he open a locked door so easily? Remember the key that had vanished from the Gruber house days before? Never found. One uncomfortable possibility. Schlittenbauer had it. Given to him, perhaps, by Victoria. When investigators later asked why he had walked alone into a possibly occupied murder house, he said he had gone to look for the boy, for Joseph, the child he called his son. It is an answer that explains everything and proves nothing. It got worse with the years. Things he said seemed to carry knowledge only the killer should have had. In 1925, he was found wandering the ruins of the demolished farm, and when asked why, he said something extraordinary. That whoever had tried to bury the family in the barn had failed because the ground was frozen. How did he know the ground had been too hard to dig? Then again, a local farmer would know that soil, that winter. He could have been guessing. That is the whole problem with Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Everything about him looks damning, and everything has an innocent explanation. The calm, shock, the knowledge of the house. He had been Victoria's lover. The easy door, the frozen ground, the strange remarks. A neighbor who knew the family and the land too well. The police questioned him for years and could never place him there, never break his account, and in the end they let him go. He spent the rest of his life fighting the accusation and more than once sued the people who called him the murderer of Hinterkaifeck, and won. In a court of law, he was not the killer. In the mind of his village, he never stopped being the prime suspect. And here is what keeps him at the top of the list. Of all 5 suspects, he is the only one who fits the whole shape of the crime. The motive, the intimate knowledge of the house, the missing key, the closeness of a man who could have come and gone unseen, who could even have been the figure in the attic, a guilty man too clever to catch, or an innocent neighbor branded a monster for behaving strangely on the worst day of his life. The second suspect had, on paper, one disqualifying problem. He was already dead. Carl Gabriel was Victoria's husband, the man she married in 1914. Months after the wedding, the war took him. He was sent to France and reported killed at Arras that December. So, how is a man who died in 1914 a suspect in a murder in 1922? Because his body never came home. In the chaos of the Western Front, his remains were never recovered. And in the years after the murders, a dark theory took hold, that Carl Gabriel had never died at all, that he had survived, learned what had happened to his home in his absence, the abuse, the child fathered by his wife's own father, and come back, not to a marriage, to a reckoning. It sounds like a ghost story, but it did not come from nowhere. The police took it seriously enough to chase it, and it found a strange second life after the next war, when men returning from Soviet captivity told of a German-speaking officer who freed them, announcing that he was the Hinterkaifeck murderer. And some wondered whether he could have been Gabriel. But the theory hits a hard wall. 2 soldiers who served beside him swore they had seen his body on the battlefield and identified him dead in France in 1914. In 1923, his death was formally confirmed, and he was ruled out. The dead husband come home for revenge is the most cinematic suspect in the case, and by the evidence the least likely. The theory endures not because the facts support it. They don't, but because it feels like justice. A wronged man returned. The truth is almost certainly colder. But the mind wants the ghost story because the ghost story at least makes sense. The third name is the one most people have never heard. Josef Bertel. He was young, about 25, from a town not far away. And roughly a year before the murders, in the summer of 1921, he had escaped from a psychiatric institution where he was being held on account of his mental state. Then he vanished. He was never recaptured. There were rumors he had joined the Foreign Legion, but no proof. He simply dropped out of the record, an unstable man at large in southern Bavaria, in exactly the window when someone was leaving footprints in the snow at Hinterkaifeck. The authorities kept wanted notices out for him for years. The appeal of Bertel is obvious. He fits the shape of the fear. An unstable stranger, escaped unaccounted for, who could have been the figure in the attic, the tracks from the forest, the smoke at the oven. The problem is just as obvious. Nothing ever tied him to the farm. But that is exactly why he lingers. The others can be argued down. Gabriel has a body. Schlittenbauer, his court victories. Bertel cannot, because there is almost nothing to argue with. He is a gap in the record shaped like a man. Escaped, vanished, never found. Not charged, and not cleared. The fourth lead points away from the lonely outsider entirely, toward men who had, allegedly, already done this kind of thing before. The Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton. Adolf was named a suspect astonishingly early, within a week of the bodies being found. The reason was his company. He was tied to a far-right paramilitary group, one of the armed militias roaming a violent, broken post-war Germany. As a member of it, he was said to have taken part in the killing of 9 farmers during the fighting in Upper Silesia in 1921. There was even a warrant out for him over those deaths. Here was a man already accused of slaughtering rural families. A very different suspect from a grieving neighbor or an escaped patient. The lead came back decades later, from inside the family itself. The lead came back decades later from inside the family itself. In 1951, a prosecutor reopened the case against the two brothers, and the reason was chilling. Their own sister, on her deathbed, had named them as the killers. Only one of them could still be questioned. Adolf was already beyond any court. He had died in 1944, so the investigation fell on Anton, who was taken into custody. But against him, as with everyone else, the evidence simply was not there. He was released, and in 1954, the case was dropped. The last suspect is the strangest, because if he did it, then Hinterkaifeck was not a local tragedy of incest and revenge at all. It was one stop on the route of a traveling monster. His name was Paul Muller, a German migrant, and the theory does not come from the German files at all. It comes from a 2017 book by an American writer that traced a pattern of family murders across the United States around the turn of the century. Whole households killed in isolated homes by night with the blunt edge of an axe or farm tool. The bodies moved and gathered together. No robbery. Their suspect was Muller. The theory was that he left America around 1912, as investigators began noticing the pattern and carried his method back across the Atlantic, to Europe, to a farm in Bavaria in 1922. Look back at Hinterkaifeck through that lens. An entire family, killed in an isolated home, the blunt edge of a farm tool, the bodies brought together, the money left behind. The pattern fits. The writer himself rates the odds at roughly a coin flip, while adding there is no real reason to think it wasn't him. It is the suspect that turns the whole story inside out. If it was the neighbor, the husband, the patient, or the brothers, then Hinterkaifeck is about the Grubers, their secrets, their enemies, their poisoned house. But if it was the man from the train, they were not targeted at all. They were simply the house at the end of the road, the next stop. So now it comes to you. 5 names have followed this case for 100 years. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor and former lover, calm among the dead, who opened a locked door he should not have been able to open, who knew things he perhaps should not have known, and who beat in court everyone who called him guilty. Carl Gabriel, the husband supposed to have died in the war, whose body came home only as a rumor, who some believe returned for revenge against the family that destroyed his marriage. Josef Bertel, the unstable man who walked out of an asylum a year before, was never found and was hunted for years in connection with these very killings. The Gump brothers, paramilitary men, one accused of slaughtering farmers before, named on their own sister's deathbed, and the man from the train, who may have murdered families across 2 continents for whom Hinterkaifeck would have meant nothing at all. One of them may have walked out of that forest, or none of them did, and the real answer died with whoever it was. So tell me, after everything, who do you think killed the people of Hinterkaifeck? Schlittenbauer, Gabriel, Bertel, the Gumps, or the man from the train? And if you think it was someone the police never even considered, I want to hear that too. Leave it in the comments. Whoever it was, they were calm and they were patient. They lived in that house with the dead for days, fed the animals, kept the fire, and felt nothing. And then they walked out into the snow and out of history. And the only tracks anyone ever found led one way, toward the house, never away from it.